Maybe you've heard that anxiety lives in the body, or you've heard the name of the book, Body Keeps the Score, this sort of thing. And in this video, I want to walk you through a much better understanding of how the body actually relates to the experience of anxiety. Because what I find in my work, whether I'm working with coaches, therapists, practitioners of all sorts, or just clients who are generally interested in figuring their own stuff out, it's really easy to pay lip service to the idea of mind-body practices, but actually thinking through what that means and how to work with it is an entirely different thing. So with that said, I should say if you want a deeper look at this, you can go to bodymindclass.com, and I've put together a little free training that's going to walk you through how some of these practices and principles can be applied in your own life. So again, bodymindclass.com, free training right there. But in this video, I want to talk through specifically how the body and anxiety interact with each other. Because once you get a sense of this, it is incredibly liberating, and you'll find that you can make some significant changes with, frankly, a lot of ease. So let's put this in perspective. Sigmund Freud, for all of the brilliance he had as a clinician, went through some convoluted mental acrobatics in terms of theorizing what was taking place in his clinical practice. So he was brilliant when working with clients, but in thinking through some of the explanations for what was taking place there, things get a little dicey. And what we know at this point is that a lot of that theory doesn't hold a lot of water. And we'll come to understand more of why as this video continues. Now, there was one thing he said about anxiety that was pretty significant, but easy to be misinterpreted, I should say. So Freud said that anxiety is the universal currency of affect. Now, that is a loaded phrase. As I said, there's a lot packed in there, but it's also quite easy to misinterpret. So we've got to wonder, how is it that anxiety is this currency that could be exchanged at equal rate for any affect you like, any emotional state, any feeling state you like? So take joy, sadness, fear, rage, any of these things you want, and you can trade them in for anxiety at any time. And in fact, you can get a great exchange rate. It's booming. You'll lose nothing on the transaction. So how is it that this comes to be? What I mean is, by what mechanism do all of these different emotions transform into anxiety? Well, that's something we're going to make some sense of as we make our way through this particular video. Now, before we get into the actual mechanism of that, I think it's really important to understand that in a complex system, and you as a biological entity, you're a complex system. Complex systems operate through what's known as cybernetic explanation. That is to say, they work through feedback, and this is very different than the cause and effect of the world of formal logic. Now, one easy example of this would be something like evolution through natural selection. That is a cybernetic process. That works through feedback, but it works a little bit differently than most people might think. And I promise we're going to help you figure out how this ties into your experience of anxiety and some of the body stuff. It'll make a lot of sense. But if you know anything about evolution, you probably know that it is the survival of the fittest. Yeah, it's the common phrase thrown around. Now, the easy trap to fall into would be to think that that means that the fittest from a population are chosen and they survive. But actually, the exact opposite is more accurate in this case. Really, evolution works by the elimination of the least fit. And this is a perfect example of cybernetic explanation in action. Cybernetic explanation works through negative selection. That is to say that it selects against bad options. It prunes away the bad options. So in the case of evolution, in a breeding population, those that aren't really suitable for the environmental conditions or aren't suitable mates, well, they're going to get selected out of the breeding pool. And so in a bit of circular logic, the fittest survive, but also those that survive are the fittest. And this circular reasoning is actually a key part of cybernetic explanation. Again, we only know after the fact who the so-called fittest are, and they're only the fittest because they weren't eliminated as bad options from the breeding population. So again, what I hope that you keep in mind as we go through the rest of this is that in complex biological systems, they operate through cybernetic explanation. That is to say that the bad fits are peeled away, and what remains isn't necessarily the fittest. What remains is the fit enough option, the good enough option. That's what remains. Now, of course, the fittest, they're somewhere in that fit enough bucket, but hopefully that makes sense and you're with me so far. Now, what does this have to do with anxiety? Well, let's circle back to Freud's idea that anxiety is the universal currency of affect. That is to say that at any point in your life, at any moment in time, you could take some emotion and you could exchange that for anxiety. Now, it's not to say you might want that, but let's assume that that emotion is intolerable or unwelcome for whatever reason. Let's say, for instance, that the experience of sadness wasn't a tolerable emotion. Let's say that you're a boy growing up in a traditional Western masculine world, and you are told that, well, boys don't cry, or you need to man up, or you need to not be such a pussy if you're experiencing this emotion of sadness. Well, what do? If you're in an environment that deems that emotional experience intolerable, you better do your best to get rid of that intolerable thing. You can see where the cybernetic pruning sort of explanation comes into play. So what do? You convert that into anxiety somehow. Now, how does this happen? Well, let's say that you are this little boy growing up in this hypermasculine Western value sort of world, and you're told, don't be a pussy, man up, boys don't cry. If you were the little boy in that case, and you were experiencing this sadness, you were about to burst into tears, what would you do? What specifically would you do within yourself so as not to be a pussy, so as not to cry, so as to man up? What you would likely do, as you do anything that you do throughout your life, is you would engage in some sort of muscular contraction. That is to say that you would engage certain muscles within the body to achieve a desired outcome. That's how we do anything we do. If I want to reach for a glass of water, I have to engage in certain muscular contractions relative to the environment in which I'm situated to accomplish that task. Same thing if I want to reach out and grab a pencil and write something. I have to engage in a series of muscular contractions to accomplish that desired outcome relative to my environment. Now, if my desired outcome is not to experience that particular affective state, that particular emotion or feeling, you do it the same way you do anything you do. And it's through a series of muscular contractions. Now, in this case, maybe it's contractions around the eyes, maybe it's a contraction around the diaphragm or the diaphragm or the throat, but you engage in some set of contractions so as to deaden or dampen that experience. Now, this is fine in short-term acute situations. Maybe you do need to compose yourself in a situation in order to maintain your sense of security. That's all well and good. But what happens is that quite often we internalize these particular standards, these normative standards, or we engage in that set of muscular contractions for so long that it becomes habitual. It becomes an automatic response. So that when we encounter that stimulus to which we might respond with a particular affective state or emotion, we have a conditioned response that clamps something down, contracts the eyes, the throat, the diaphragm, whatever the case may be. And again, it's fine if this takes place in a short-term situation. It's not so good if this is a long-term automatic strategy. So what I would suggest is that these contractions, these restrictions, these muscular activities that we engage in automatically, these aren't just a squeezing of the biceps or a squeezing of the musculature around the eyes. What this is a meaning-saturated restriction of your functional capacity as an organism relative to an environment. Now that's a loaded phrase. Again, a meaning-saturated restriction of your functional capacity as an organism relative to the environment. So let's see if we can break that down, because this has everything to do with our experience of anxiety, everything to do with our experience of restricted emotional tolerances, everything to do, quite frankly, with our experience of limitations in our biological function. So let's take this meaning-saturated idea. What's meaning in this case? Well, it's to say that that contraction of muscular tissues is certainly not meaningless. But again, that's just a flip-flop. It doesn't quite tell us what meaning is. So I'll defer to the biologist, the anthropologist, Gregory Bateson, who, in an essay called Style, Grace, and Information in Primitive Art, said something to the extent of meaning is an approximate synonym of information, pattern, redundancy, and restraint. And this helps us figure out a lot about what meaning is, or what's meaningful. What's meaningful to us in our lives is that which helps us find a pattern in our experiences. What's meaningful in our lives is that which is informative for us. It actually puts us in a form. It shapes us over the course of our lives. What's meaningful to us helps us recognize some amount of redundancy, some amount of predictability in our lives. And so when we're experiencing these meaning-saturated restrictions, this is saying that that shape, the contraction of the eyes, bracing through the throat, the clenching of the diaphragm, these are not simply random. These are related to patterns of organismic behavior, of you as an organism, relative to the environment. These actually, they contain, let's say, or they carry information about your historical patterns of relationship to the world around you. And in terms of redundancy, they're actually somewhat predictive. If you want to know what shape you're going to be in 10 years from now, look at the overall body pattern that you exhibit now and exaggerate that 10%, 20%. That's a really good bet of the shape your body is going to make in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. So let's say that you're making this sort of shape currently. Well, exaggerate that. Squeeze that musculature the littlest bit more, and you've likely got a little bit of a clue as to how your body's going to be in 10 years' time. Or if this is the certain shape. Same thing. Exaggerate this tendency, and you get a sense of why we have this widespread societal notion that the older you get, the more shrunken and shriveled and decrepit you become. Now, is that necessary? I don't think so, but it does beg the question, what do we do about it? This is where that second part of the phrase comes into play, the functional restriction of the organism relative to the environment. So we've got the meaning-saturated part. It is to say that this shape isn't accidental, and it isn't random. It is informative of some past adaptation to an environment. It is patterned relative to stimuli in the environment, and it is redundant in that it offers us some predictive capacity as to where you're going to be in 10 years' time. Now, this functional restriction, or a restriction of your functional capacity, that's not insignificant either, because every engagement of your musculature, every contraction you make of the eyes, the throat, the diaphragm, it's not just a restriction of that response or of that emotion in that situation. When you engage that musculature, it's involved in an activity and it's unavailable for other activity. So if you're the boy who was experiencing sadness in response to something in the environment, and you were told, don't be a pussy, man up, don't cry, and you restrict the movement of the diaphragm, can you think of a biological function relative to the environment that's restricted? Well, go figure. It's your capacity to breathe in that case, which I hear, I'm not sold, but I hear is important for a couple of things here and there. If you want to have a decent life, knowing how to breathe well is a pretty useful thing, yeah? So this restriction then, in this hypothetical example of the boy, the eyes, the diaphragm, the throat, we can see how that meaning-saturated restriction, it impedes functional capacity in a broad set of functions. So it's not just limited to that particular context. This restricts capacity in walking, running, exercise, all of the other things. Laughing, that requires your ability to exchange air with the environment. So the challenge is that when we restrict our experience in one domain, it doesn't just stay a restriction of that domain. It ripples out into all sorts of other scenarios. So here's what I propose, and I would love to hear what you think of it too. What I propose is that anxiety is the act of restricting. Anxiety isn't some other state necessarily. Anxiety is the restriction. It is the contracting of those tissues. Anxiety is the experience of a meaning-saturated restriction of your functional capacity. Because the moment you begin to constrict and engage those tissues, you're unavailable for activity in the world around you. At least you're not as available as you would be otherwise, as you would be without that unnecessary constriction. Now, we could go so far as to say that any engagement of muscular tissue that isn't accomplishing a specific intentioned task relative to the environment, almost any tension could be called anxiety in this case. The stiffness in the back at the end of the day, the bracing through the shoulders and the neck at the end of the day, those could be an experience of anxiety. Now, it doesn't mean that you're having a panic attack necessarily. What it means is that you have perhaps exchanged some intolerable, some unwanted affect for anxiety. Again, coming full circle to Freud in this case. If anxiety is, in fact, the universal currency of affect, what we're looking at here in a biological system like the human organism is the sense that anxiety is the restricting. It is the closing off of certain perceptions, certain states, certain feelings or thoughts along with it. And the word itself, anxiety, it gives us a bit of a clue. It derives from the Latin ango angere, which means something to the extent of to tie, to bind, to narrow. And what is it that we're doing when we're constricting our musculature unnecessarily relative to the current environment? That is to say, it may have been necessary historically, but it may not be necessary any longer. Well, when we're engaged in those contractions, we are tying, we are binding, we are narrowing ourselves. And when we do that, not only are we reducing our functional capacity relative to the environment, we are actually narrowing the window of human experience. Because when the musculature is involved in bracing, in maintaining a sort of armoring relative to the environment, in binding against a particular experience, again, it's not then available for the refined sensitivity that we might want if we want to live a more sensorially satisfactory life, let's say. So hopefully this gives you some food for thought. Personally, I find this a fascinating, winding, linking of ideas. If you have questions about this, please feel free to drop them in the comments below. I would love to hear what this stirs up for you. But for the time being, if you want to put this into practice, I would recommend spend some time tuning into the state of the body, what your habitual patterns of tension might be. If you find that you're the sort of person where your shoulders always creep up to your ears, maybe open yourself to the possibility that that's not just a matter of stretching and strengthening some of those tissues, or wedging yourself into, quote, proper posture or proper alignment. Maybe there is something a little more going on behind the scenes. These restrictions in our ability to move, in our range of motion, in the shapes that we make with the body through the day, very rarely are these simply a matter of physical or physiological processes. More often than not, given the fact that we are cognitive and conscious organisms as well, more often than not, these are, in fact, meaning saturated. These do inform us something about our historical patterns of relationship to the world then. And to the extent that we're unable to differentiate between the world then and the world now, we remain fixed in these patterns. So if you can bring awareness to your particular tendencies, and you can listen in and get a sense of what might be hiding underneath the surface here, beneath what's obvious, you can make a profound change within your own experience. Because when these tissues start to regain their suppleness, let's say, when they start to reclaim some of the options for their positioning relative to the rest of the body, you may well start to sense quite a bit more. That sensing may open you up to experiencing quite a bit more feeling or affective state as well. And that may help you change your perspective about some of the stickier issues that you may find yourself faced with again and again throughout your life. So, I recognize that this is a lot to chew on in one little video. So with that said, if you want to see how you can start to work with these a bit more, again, I would encourage you to go to bodymindclass.com, bodymindclass.com, spelled exactly as it sounds. You can sign up there for a free training I put together on the movement as metaphor practice, basically figuring out how you can get the body involved in making some of the more personal or psychological changes that you're after as well. And again, if you have any thoughts, questions, comments you'd care to share, you can drop those down below. I'd love to hear from you. So thanks again for your attention. I know it is your most valuable resource. And again, I hope you find this helpful.